That woman is trying to break into our house." Amanda Whitmore screamed as the police cruiser rolled to a stop beside the curb, its red and blue lights flashing across the quiet street like a storm nobody had prepared for. I stood frozen beside my garage, still holding the paper grocery bag I'd carried home from Mason's Market less than 10 minutes earlier. A carton of eggs pressed against my arm. The porch light above my front door flickered softly in the warm Georgia air. One of the officers stepped out slowly, his hand hovering near his belt as he looked directly at me. "Ma'am, can you step away from the property for a moment?" he asked. "Property. Not home. Not house. Property." Across the street, Amanda stood on her lawn in white tennis clothes, one hand pressed dramatically against her chest, while her husband Scott pointed toward me like he was identifying someone dangerous on television. Their golden retriever barked wildly beside them. Curtains shifted all down the block. People were watching. I could feel it without even turning my head. The neighborhood always became quiet when something happened on Elderwood Lane. Too quiet. "Officer," I said carefully, tightening my grip on the grocery bag. "This is my home." My voice sounded calmer than I felt. The younger officer glanced at the older one before looking back at me. "Do you have identification with your address on it?" Behind him, Amanda let out a small laugh that she tried to disguise as nervous breathing. "I told you," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She's pretending." Pretending. I stared at the woman for a moment, trying to understand how we had gotten here. 8 months earlier, the Whitmores had arrived with matching SUVs, fresh landscaping, and smiles that never reached their eyes. Amanda baked cookies for the Homeowners Association meeting her first week in the neighborhood. Scott shook every man's hand twice. People loved them immediately. Meanwhile, I had lived on this street for 28 years. My late husband Harold and I bought this house back in 1998 when the neighborhood still had cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. We planted the magnolia tree in the front yard. Ourselves the summer after we moved in. Harold used to joke that the roots would outlive both of us. He'd been right about that. A breeze moved softly through the tree now as the officer waited for me to answer. I slowly set the grocery bag down on the driveway and reached into my purse. My fingers trembled slightly against the leather wallet inside. Somewhere nearby, a phone camera clicked on. "This neighborhood has changed so much," Amanda suddenly said, shaking her head with fake sadness. "You just can't be too careful anymore." The words settled over the street like smoke. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. I handed my ID to the officer. He studied it for several seconds. Then he looked at the house behind me, then back at Amanda. The older officer stepped closer to the garage keypad mounted beside the door. "Ma'am," he asked quietly, "if this is your house, why doesn't your code work?" My stomach dropped, because I had typed the same 4 numbers twice before the police arrived. And both times, the keypad blinked red. The officer pressed the keypad himself. For slow beeps echoed into the humid evening air. Red light again. He frowned slightly and stepped back from the garage door while the younger officer kept glancing between me and the Whitmores across the street. Amanda folded her arms tightly, as if she was protecting herself from something dangerous. Scott stood beside her with the stiff posture of a man pretending to stay calm for everyone else. I could already see the story forming in the minds of the people watching from their windows. Older black woman. Confused. Maybe unstable. Maybe lost. Maybe somewhere she did not belong. The younger officer handed my license back carefully. "The address matches," he admitted quietly. Amanda immediately shook her head. "Anybody can fake an address," she said. "She has been wandering around the property for 20 minutes. Wandering. I had lived in that house longer than she had probably lived in Georgia. My fingers tightened around my wallet. The grocery bag still sat on the driveway beside me. One of the eggs had cracked inside the carton. I could smell it faintly mixing with the scent of fresh-cut grass. And hot pavement. "Miss Brooks," the older officer said gently, "when was the last time you used the keypad?" "Yesterday morning," I answered. "It worked fine." He nodded slowly but did not say anything else. Across the street, another curtain moved. Then another. Phones glowed faintly behind windows like tiny floating squares. Elderwood Lane had always been the kind of neighborhood where people smiled during Christmas cookie exchanges and avoided eye contact during uncomfortable moments. Nobody stepped outside now. Nobody said, "Evelyn has lived here for years." Nobody said, "Harold Brooks built that front porch himself." Silence can become its own kind of agreement after a while. Amanda suddenly took 2 quick steps forward. "Officer, I told you she scared me," she said. I saw her standing by the garage messing with the keypad over and over. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Her blonde ponytail was still perfect despite the heat. Her white sneakers were spotless. Her voice trembled in exactly the right places. She had practiced being believable her entire life. "Ma'am," the younger officer asked me carefully, "do you have another way inside the home?" "My front door key," I answered. "Then maybe we should try that." Scott shifted immediately beside Amanda. Too quickly. Just a flicker. But I saw it. Amanda saw it too because she grabbed his wrist for half a second before letting go. Small movements tell the truth long before words do. I walked slowly toward the front porch with both officers behind me. The porch light cast a pale yellow glow across the flower pots Harold used to repaint every spring. One of the officers glanced at the framed wind chime hanging beside the door. It still had Harold's initials carved into the wood. HB 1998. I slid the brass key into the lock. Turned it once. The deadbolt clicked open immediately. Nobody spoke. The older officer exhaled softly under his breath. Behind us, Amanda's voice rose sharper than before. "Well, maybe she used to live there," she snapped. "That does not explain the garage." I opened the front door slowly and looked into my dark hallway. Everything was exactly where I left it that morning. Harold's fishing hat still hung beside the coat rack. My reading glasses rested on the little table near the stairs. Familiar. Quiet. Mine. But something inside me no longer felt safe. The older officer stepped closer to the garage control panel mounted beside the hallway entrance. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, "has anybody done work on your garage system recently?" And for the first time that night, my stomach turned cold because I suddenly remembered Scott Whitmore standing inside my garage 2 days earlier smiling while he said, "These older systems are tricky sometimes. Good thing your neighbors look out for you." The older officer crouched beside the garage control panel while I stood quietly near the kitchen doorway, trying to steady my breathing. Outside, the flashing police lights still painted streaks of blue and red across the living room walls. I could hear Amanda speaking softly on the sidewalk, her voice carrying just enough to sound frightened to anyone listening. Scott had gone strangely quiet. That bothered me more than anything. Men like Scott Whitmore always had something to say. "This system was manually reset," the officer finally said as he stood up slowly. "Recently." I looked toward the garage door at the end of the hallway. Harold installed that keypad himself almost 15 years ago after somebody broke into cars around the neighborhood. I remembered standing beside him in the summer heat while he read instructions through bifocals sliding down his nose. He spent 2 hours making sure every wire was perfect because Harold believed if a thing protected your family, it deserved patience. "I did not reset anything," I said quietly. The younger officer looked toward the older one again. Something had shifted between them. The certainty from earlier had started to crack. Outside, a car rolled slowly down the street before stopping near the curb. More people. More watching. Elderwood Lane suddenly felt smaller than it had in 28 years. The older officer stepped onto the porch and called toward Scott. "Sir, you mentioned helping Miss Brooks with her garage recently?" Scott hesitated before walking halfway across the lawn. Amanda stayed close. Behind him, like she was afraid to let him answer alone. "Just neighbor stuff," Scott replied with a quick smile. "She was having trouble with the keypad a few days ago." I stared at him. "I never asked for help," I said. His eyes moved toward me for only a second. "You seemed confused about it," he answered lightly. Confused. There it was again. Small words. Soft words. The kind people used when they wanted to make somebody sound unstable without saying it directly. Amanda folded her arms tighter. "Honestly, officer, we were only trying to protect the neighborhood," she said. "You hear stories all the time now." The younger officer shifted awkwardly beside the porch railing. He looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. I noticed his gaze drift toward the framed photograph sitting near my front hallway mirror. Harold stood beside me in that picture wearing his old Braves cap, one arm around my shoulder, while we smiled in front of this very house on the day we paid off the mortgage. Summer of 2012. The magnolia tree behind us was barely taller than the mailbox then. "You have lived here a long time?" he asked quietly. "Since before your patrol car was probably built," I answered. He almost smiled at that, but stopped himself. Outside, Amanda let out a nervous laugh that sounded forced now. The older officer stepped farther into the garage and suddenly frowned. "Miss Brooks," he called. "Where is your camera system?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" "There are empty mounts above the side entrance," he said. "Looks like security cameras used to be installed there." My chest tightened slowly. Harold installed 3 cameras after his heart surgery because he worried about me being alone if something ever happened to him. One above the garage, one facing the driveway, one near the mailbox. I walked into the garage and stared upward. Empty brackets, loose wires hanging near the ceiling. My stomach turned cold. "They were there last week," I whispered. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then from outside, almost too quickly, Amanda said, "Maybe they stopped working." I turned toward the open garage door and looked directly at her standing beneath the flashing lights. And for the first time that night, Amanda Whitmore looked afraid. The officers finally turned off the flashing lights a few minutes later, but the neighborhood still felt frozen in place. People remained behind curtains pretending not to stare. Amanda and Scott stood together near their mailbox, speaking in low voices while the older officer took notes beside his patrol car. I stayed inside my kitchen holding a glass of water I had not touched. My hands were steady now. Too steady. That usually meant I was angry. The younger officer stepped carefully into the kitchen doorway. "Miss Brooks," he said softly, "we are going to file this as a neighborhood dispute for now." Neighborhood dispute. Such clean words for something that had left me standing outside my own home while strangers questioned whether I belonged there. I nodded once because I did not trust myself to speak yet. He hesitated before continuing. "You may want to contact someone about reinstalling your security system." I looked past him through the front window. Scott Whitmore glanced toward the house at that exact moment before quickly looking away again. My stomach tightened. After the police finally drove off, the silence on Elderwood Lane returned almost instantly. That was the thing about quiet neighborhoods. They swallowed ugly moments fast. Porch lights clicked off one by one. Curtains closed. Cars disappeared into garages. By tomorrow morning, people would walk their dogs and wave politely like none of this had happened. But I knew better. I set the untouched groceries on the counter and slowly walked through the house, turning on lamps. Harold used to do that every evening before sunset. "A house should never greet you in darkness," he always said. The warm light filled the living room softly, touching old photographs, bookshelves, and the faded quilt folded over Harold's recliner. Familiar things. Safe things. Yet every room suddenly felt different tonight. I paused near the hallway table and stared at the framed neighborhood Christmas photo from 6 years earlier. Harold stood in the back row wearing a ridiculous reindeer sweater while everybody laughed around him. The Turners. The Millers. Old Mrs. Green before she moved to Florida. Back then, Elderwood Lane still felt like a place where people knew each other beyond property lines and lawn maintenance. That changed slowly after Harold died. First came the letters from the Homeowners Association about tiny things nobody used to care about. My mailbox paint was fading. My hedges were uneven. Somebody complained that my wind chimes were disruptive during evening hours. Then real estate flyers started appearing in my mailbox every week. Cash offer for your property. No repairs needed. Ready to downsize? At first I laughed them off. But after the Whitmores moved in, the pressure became harder to ignore. Amanda always smiled too brightly whenever she mentioned retirement communities. Scott offered to help with repairs I never requested. They spoke to me the way people speak to somebody they expect to leave soon. I walked slowly into the garage again and looked up at the empty camera mounts. 3 missing cameras. Not broken. Removed. The loose wires hung there like unfinished sentences. I suddenly remembered something else. 3 nights ago, around 9:30, I had looked out my bedroom window after hearing voices near the driveway. Scott Whitmore had been standing beside my garage with a flashlight while Amanda waited near the sidewalk. When I asked if everything was all right, Scott smiled and held up his phone. "Just checking the internet connection," he called out casually. At the time, I believed him because decent people usually do believe their neighbors. Now I stood alone in the garage replaying every conversation I had ever had with the Whitmores, every smile, every offer to help, every carefully chosen word. And for the first time since Harold passed away, I realized something cold and painful. They did not want my friendship. They wanted my house. The next morning arrived heavy and gray, the kind of Georgia humidity that clung to the windows before sunrise. I barely slept. Every creak of the house had sounded unfamiliar during the night. Around 6:30, I carried my coffee onto the front porch and sat quietly beneath the magnolia tree Harold planted all those years ago. The street looked perfectly normal again. Sprinklers clicked across fresh lawns. Somebody jogged past wearing headphones. A school bus stopped at the corner. Elderwood Lane had already decided to move on from what happened, but I could feel it lingering underneath everything like a stain nobody wanted to acknowledge. Amanda Whitmore stepped outside around 7 wearing sunglasses much larger than necessary. She froze slightly when she noticed me on the porch. Then came the performance. "Good morning, Evelyn," she called with artificial brightness. "Crazy night, huh?" I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup. "Was it?" I asked calmly. For a second, her smile slipped. Just for a second. Then Scott opened their garage door, and she quickly disappeared inside beside him. I watched the garage close slowly behind them. The keypad worked perfectly for their house. Around noon, I drove to the hardware store to ask about replacing my security cameras. The young employee behind the counter explained that newer systems automatically backed footage up to cloud storage. "A lot safer that way," he said cheerfully. I nodded while thinking about my empty garage mounts. Harold never trusted internet storage much. "If something matters," he used to say, "keep your own copy." On the drive home, I stopped at the neighborhood mailboxes near the entrance sign. My mailbox door squeaked softly when I opened it. Bills. Grocery coupons. Another postcard from a real estate company asking if I had considered selling my property for cash. I almost laughed. As I turned back toward my car, a familiar brown delivery truck rolled slowly around the corner before stopping beside the curb. Marcus Hill leaned out the driver window wearing his usual navy UPS cap tilted crooked over one eyebrow. Marcus had delivered packages around this neighborhood for years. Harold liked him immediately because he always waved at everybody instead of rushing through his route. "Miss Brooks," he called carefully. "You doing all right?" I gave a small shrug. "I have had better Tuesdays." Marcus studied my face for a moment before lowering his voice. "I heard about last night." Of course he had. Everybody had. News traveled fast in neighborhoods where people pretended not to gossip. "I mind my business," Marcus continued slowly. "But something about that whole thing felt wrong." I leaned against my car door quietly. He glanced around once before speaking again. "My truck was parked near your driveway around 8:45 last night. I was delivering to the Peterson place." My stomach tightened. "Okay," I said carefully. Marcus tapped the side of his truck mirror. "My dashboard camera runs whenever the engine is on. Usually it records over itself every 48 hours. He paused. "But the upload system glitched this week, so everything from yesterday is still saved." For the first time since the police cars left my house, I felt something besides anger. I felt possibility. Marcus lowered his sunglasses slightly and looked directly at me. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I think my camera may have recorded your neighbors before the police showed up." The afternoon heat suddenly felt thinner somehow. Across the street from the mailbox station, a realtor sign swayed gently in the breeze outside a vacant property. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled softly beyond the trees. I looked back at Marcus while my pulse slowed into something colder and steadier than fear. "Can you show me the footage?" I asked. Marcus gave one slow nod. "That is exactly why I stopped." Marcus parked his truck beside my driveway just after 3 o'clock that afternoon. The sky had turned dark with summer clouds, and the air smelled like rain waiting to happen. I led him through the front door while he carried a small tablet tucked under one arm. He moved carefully inside the house, glancing around at the photographs and furniture with quiet respect. "Mr. Brooks always kept this place looking sharp," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "He would complain if you tracked dirt on the floors." Marcus laughed once under his breath before setting the tablet on my dining room table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room felt strangely still except for the ticking wall clock Harold bought at an antique market years ago. Marcus tapped the screen a few times. "The camera angle is not perfect," he warned, "but it covers most of the street." I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. Then the footage began. Grainy evening light filled the screen. Marcus's delivery truck sat near the Peterson house across the street from mine. Timestamp: 8:11 p.m. Nothing unusual at first. Cars passing. Porch lights flickering on as the sun disappeared. Then Scott Whitmore entered the frame wearing a dark polo shirt and baseball cap. My chest tightened immediately. He crossed the street carrying something long in his hand. "Pause it," I whispered. Marcus froze the image. It was one of my security cameras. Scott looked around once before walking directly toward my garage. My stomach dropped cold and heavy. Marcus hit play again. Scott disappeared briefly beside the garage wall. A minute later, Amanda walked into frame holding her phone against her chest. She stayed near the sidewalk while Scott worked near the garage keypad. Then came the moment that made my hands go still in my lap. Scott stepped back from the wall holding loose wires in one hand. My wires. My cameras. Amanda looked toward him and smiled. Marcus lowered the tablet volume as if instinctively giving the moment privacy. The footage continued. Scott typed something into the keypad several times. Red flashes blinked each time. He was changing the access code. Deliberately. Calmly. Like a man resetting his own garage after work. "Oh my God," I whispered before I could stop myself. Marcus stayed quiet. He understood this was no longer about a misunderstanding. On screen, Amanda suddenly straightened and lifted her phone to her ear. Even without audio, I recognized the performance immediately. One hand against her chest. Nervous pacing. Fear carefully arranged across her face. 30 seconds later, she pointed dramatically toward my house, just as the first police lights appeared at the end of the street. Scott quickly crossed back to his lawn beside her. They rehearsed their innocence in real time. I leaned back slowly in my chair while the footage continued playing. The dining room suddenly felt colder than before. Marcus finally paused the video and looked at me carefully. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly. "They planned this." I stared at the frozen image on the tablet screen. Amanda and Scott standing side by side beneath the street lamp pretending to be frightened neighbors protecting their community. Two people trying to erase me from the very street where Harold and I built our entire life together. Rain began tapping softly against the windows then. Slow at first, then heavier. I folded my hands together tightly on the table while something inside me settled into place with surprising calmness. Fear had kept me awake the night before. Confusion had followed me all morning. But confusion was gone now. The truth sat right there on the screen in front of me. Clear. Quiet. Impossible to explain away. And for the first time since the police arrived at my house, I realized the Whitmores had made one very serious mistake. They assumed nobody was watching them. Marcus copied the footage onto a flash drive before leaving my house that evening. Rain still tapped softly against the roof as I walked him to the front door. "You should probably send that to the police," he said carefully. I looked down at the small silver drive resting in my palm. "I will," I answered. "But not tonight." Marcus studied my face for a moment like he was trying to decide whether I was all right. Then he nodded once. "Mr. Brooks used to say you were tougher than people realized." That almost made me smile. After he drove away, I sat alone in the living room with the flash drive beside my teacup and listened to the storm outside. The house no longer felt frightened. Angry, maybe. Wounded, certainly. But not frightened. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed softly on the coffee table. Then again. I frowned and picked it up. 3 notifications from the Elderwood Lane Homeowners Association Facebook group. I almost ignored them. Usually the page was full of complaints about trash bins or barking dogs. But tonight felt different. Someone had posted about the police arriving at my house. I opened the page slowly. Hundreds of comments already. Scary situation. Thank goodness Amanda called quickly. You can never be too careful these days. I stared at the screen while something cold settled behind my ribs. Not one person asked what actually happened. Not one person mentioned that I had lived there for nearly 3 decades. To them, I had become a suspicious stranger in a single evening. Another notification appeared. Then another. Private messages now. Some awkward. Some performative. Hope everything is okay. I'm sure it was just confusion. One message simply read, "Maybe it is time to move somewhere safer for your age." I set the phone down slowly beside the flash drive. There it was again. The quiet push. The same gentle pressure wrapped in concern. Harold used to call it polished cruelty. The kind that smiled while removing your chair from the table. The next morning, Elderwood Lane looked restless. Amanda's SUV was gone before sunrise. Scott left 20 minutes later without waving at anybody. Meanwhile, neighbors suddenly found reasons to linger near my property. Dog walkers slowed down in front of the house. Joggers glanced toward the garage before looking away quickly. Everybody knew something had shifted, even if they did not know what yet. Around 11, my doorbell rang. Mrs. Turner stood on the porch holding a lemon loaf wrapped in plastic. "Evelyn," she said softly, "I just wanted to check on you." I looked at the loaf, then at her face. Mrs. Turner and I attended the same church for 17 years. She never once visited after Harold's funeral. That is kind of you, I answered politely. She hesitated. Amanda said the police found you outside trying to get in. I almost laughed at how carefully she phrased it. Like she wanted permission to believe me without risking disagreement with the Whitmores. The police found me standing in my own driveway, I replied calmly. Mrs. Turner shifted uncomfortably. Well, I am sure there are two sides. Two sides. I thanked her for the loaf anyway and closed the door gently. By afternoon, another notification appeared on my phone. The Homeowners Association announced an emergency community meeting scheduled for Friday evening regarding recent safety concerns. Safety concerns. I stared at those words for a long moment. Outside my front window, the Whitmores returned home at exactly 4:15. Amanda stepped out of the passenger seat wearing oversized sunglasses again despite the cloudy weather. Scott carried grocery bags inside without speaking to her. Their movements looked sharper now. Faster. Tighter. Like people trying not to panic. I watched quietly from behind the curtains while the flash drive remained beside my coffee cup on the table. They still believed the story belonged to them. They still believed I was the woman standing helpless in a driveway while police lights flashed across my face. But stories change once the truth enters the room. And the truth was sitting 10 feet away from me in a silver flash drive beside a cold cup of tea. Friday evening arrived thick with heat and tension. By 6:45, the parking lot outside the Elderwood Lane clubhouse was nearly full. Expensive SUVs lined the curb beneath glowing streetlights while neighbors gathered in small, nervous groups near the entrance pretending to discuss weather and traffic. I sat quietly inside my car for a moment before stepping out. Harold always said people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they are protecting their comfort. Tonight, I intended to let them reveal everything. I wore the black suit Harold loved most on me. Simple pearl earrings. Low heels. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. The silver flash drive rested inside my purse beside my house keys. When I entered the clubhouse, conversations softened almost instantly. Not silence exactly. Just that uncomfortable thinning of sound people create when guilt enters a room. The Homeowners Association president, Daniel Mercer, stood near the front arranging papers with forced seriousness. Amanda Whitmore sat in the second row beside Scott, wearing a pale blue sweater despite the heat outside. Her smile looked brittle tonight. Scott avoided eye contact completely. I chose a seat near the aisle and folded my hands calmly in my lap, while neighbors continued slipping glances toward me. Mrs. Turner sat 3 chairs away, but did not speak. At exactly 7 o'clock, Daniel cleared his throat into the microphone. Thank you all for coming on short notice, he began. As many of you know, there was a concerning incident earlier this week involving neighborhood safety. Safety again. Always safety. Such a polite word for fear wrapped in privilege. Daniel continued speaking about vigilance and communication while I watched Amanda carefully. She nodded at all the right moments, occasionally lowering her eyes like someone recovering from trauma. If I had not seen the footage myself, I might have believed her too. Then Daniel invited Amanda to explain her experience. Amanda stood slowly, one hand resting dramatically against her chest. I truly never wanted any division in this neighborhood, she began softly. I was scared. I saw someone trying to enter a garage late at night, and I reacted as any woman alone would. Several people nodded immediately. Scott stared at the carpet. Amanda's voice trembled in practiced little waves. We all deserve to feel safe where we live. There it was again. Where we live. Not where I live. Not where I have lived nearly 30 years. Just where we live. A line carefully drawn without ever saying it aloud. Daniel thanked her gently before asking if anyone else wanted to speak. For a moment, nobody moved. Then I stood up slowly. Chairs creaked softly around the room as people shifted uncomfortably. I did not raise my voice. I did not look angry. Harold taught me long ago that calmness unsettles dishonest people more than shouting ever will. Amanda is right about one thing, I said quietly. Everyone deserves to feel safe where they live. The room stayed still. Even the air conditioner seemed louder suddenly. I reached into my purse and placed the silver flash drive carefully onto the front table beside Daniel's papers. Amanda's face changed instantly. Just a flicker, but enough. Scott finally looked up. 3 nights ago, I continued calmly. I was asked to prove I belonged inside my own home while police officers stood in my driveway and my neighbors watched from behind curtains. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. What frightened me most was not the police, I said softly. It was realizing how quickly people accepted the idea that I did not belong here anymore. Amanda's fingers tightened visibly around the edge of her chair. Scott looked pale beneath the clubhouse lights now. I turned toward Daniel and gently slid the flash drive closer to him across the table. I believe this contains the rest of the story, I said. And for the first time since this all began, nobody in the room looked at me with suspicion anymore. They looked at the Whitmores. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Daniel plugged the flash drive into the clubhouse television. The room remained painfully still except for the soft hum of the air conditioner overhead. Then the footage began playing across the large screen mounted on the wall. Grainy streetlights. Marcus's delivery truck parked near the Peterson house. Scott Whitmore crossing the street, carrying my security camera in his hand. A low murmur spread through the room immediately. Amanda's face drained of color beside him. On screen, Scott removed the cameras one by one while Amanda stood nearby, watching calmly with her phone in hand. Then came the garage keypad. The code changes. The staged panic. The rehearsed fear. Every ugly little detail unfolded slowly beneath the bright clubhouse lights while my neighbors watched in silence. Nobody looked at me anymore. They were all staring at the Whitmores now. Mrs. Turner covered her mouth softly with one hand. Daniel Mercer paused the video halfway through and removed his glasses like he suddenly could not bear to wear them anymore. "Scott," he said quietly, "is this real?" Scott swallowed hard but said nothing. Amanda tried first. "This is being taken out of context," she said quickly. "We were trying to protect the neighborhood." Even she sounded uncertain now. Daniel stared at her for a long moment before pressing play again. The footage continued until the police cars arrived and Amanda performed fear beneath the flashing lights, while Scott calmly returned to his lawn beside her. Then the screen went dark. Nobody moved. Elderwood Lane had finally seen itself clearly for the first time in years. The silence inside that clubhouse felt heavier than any argument could have. Amanda stood abruptly and grabbed her purse. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, though her voice trembled now. "We are being attacked." For caring about safety. But the room no longer belonged to her performance. People avoided her eyes the same way they avoided mine 3 nights earlier. Scott remained seated staring down at the carpet like a man watching his life collapse inch by inch. I stood quietly near the back wall with my hands folded while neighbors shifted uncomfortably around me. Some looked ashamed. Others looked frightened by what they had almost participated in. Daniel cleared his throat carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "the Whitmores should leave tonight. Not leave the meeting. Leave the neighborhood." Nobody argued. Amanda stared around the room, waiting for support that never came. Then she turned sharply toward Scott. "Say something," she hissed under her breath. But Scott only stood up slowly and walked toward the exit without looking at anyone. Amanda followed seconds later with stiff, angry steps echoing across the clubhouse floor. The doors closed behind them softly. That was the loudest part. 3 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on the Whitmores' lawn. By then, the story had spread far beyond Elderwood Lane. The police department reopened the report. Amanda quietly lost her position with the real estate agency downtown. Scott stopped attending homeowners meetings completely. People who once crossed the street to speak with them now suddenly remembered other errands. Elderwood Lane returned to normal the way neighborhoods always do after scandal. Lawns got mowed. Mail arrived. Children rode bicycles past the clubhouse again. But something had changed beneath the surface. People waved at me differently now. More carefully. More honestly. One quiet Saturday morning in early September, I sat on my front porch watering Harold's magnolias while a moving truck pulled away from the Whitmores' house across the street. Amanda never looked in my direction. Scott glanced once before lowering his eyes. Then they were gone. Just like that. The neighborhood grew still again after the truck disappeared around the corner. I leaned back slowly in Harold's old porch chair and looked out at the street we built our life on nearly 30 years earlier. The same sidewalks. The same trees. The same house standing exactly where it always had. A little girl from 2 houses down rode her bicycle past my driveway before stopping near the mailbox. "Miss Brooks?" she asked shyly. "Are you the lady from the video?" I smiled softly at her. "No, sweetheart," I answered. "I'm the lady who stayed."